This is a tree, one of the most common objects on Earth, yet the rarest in the known universe. However, these simple plants are actually not what you think they are. In 1634, a Dutch scientist named Jan Baptist van Helmont was arrested by agents of the Spanish Inquisition. The reason for his arrest was studying plants and science. The Spanish were ruling the southern part of the Netherlands at this time, which today is Belgium, put van Helmont under house arrest, thus restricting him from going anywhere. It was at this time locked up in his own house when van Helmont, already a plant expert, started to ask himself how plants grew in the first place. It's common knowledge that as trees grow, their roots pierce into the soil and collect nutrients, which are then used to make the tree bigger. This means that eventually, a full-grown tree will be made up of the nutrients it got from the soil. It's a simple and straightforward process that to most people is common knowledge. Van Helmont, however, noticed that there was something missing with his commonly known explanation of how trees grow. To explain it, take a look at this. This is a willow sapling. It's tiny and barely weighs 2 kilograms by itself. This, on the other hand, is the same willow, except for the fact that it is full-grown and weighs 200 kilograms, 100 times its mass from when it was a sapling. By the law of conservation of mass, that weight had to come from somewhere. This place that most people know where the mass came from is the soil. However, this would mean that the soil would have become 200 kilograms less than before, thus leaving a big hole around the tree. Trees do not have big holes around them, though, which means that either the soil gets regenerated from somewhere else, such as organic matter decomposing, or even stranger, that trees are actually not made up primarily from nutrients from the soil. Instead, their mass might come from somewhere else entirely. This question bothered van Helmont deeply, so to figure out the answer, he came up with a very brilliant experiment. Van Helmont's experiment started with a young small willow tree that he had. He put exactly 200 pounds of dried soil into a clay basin and planted his willow tree there. For the next 5 years, he closely monitored the plant without removing or adding anything to the basin, except for watering it constantly. If the tree was getting all that it was using to grow from the soil, then the soil in the basin would decrease as the tree grows. If the soil stayed the same or minimally decreased, then the components that make up the tree are from somewhere else. 5 years later, Van Helmont's original sapling, which only weighed 5 pounds in the beginning, was now 164 pounds, and the soil had barely changed its mass. It had only lost 0.1 pounds in the span of 5 years. This was a shocking observation which had no reasonable explanation. If trees gain hundreds of kilograms in mass as they grow, then where does it all come from if it isn't the soil? Van Helmont concluded that a tree gains its mass from all the water, in this case the water that he had been using to water the tree for the previous 5 years. This made some sense, as trees would then become like many other living organisms such as humans, who are primarily made out of water. As much as it made sense, however, Van Helmont was wrong. His willow tree did not actually gain its mass from the water, and so the mystery behind what trees really were continued. Fast forward in time, and it's now the late 1700s. A relatively young English scientist named Joseph Priestley was visiting an alcohol brewery when he noticed something very strange. Around the brewery there were many rats, and each time a rat fell into one of the vats in the brewery, it quickly died. There was no rat poison inside the vats or anything that would kill the rat in a matter of minutes. So what was causing the rats to die? Priestley guessed that it was a gas that was produced in the vats. So to test this, he lowered a bucket of water into one of the vats to hang inside as the beer inside was being brewed. If the gas was produced in the vat, then gas molecules would get trapped in the water bucket, and as they got released, they would bubble out of the water. So when Priestley removed the bucket out of the vat, sure enough, the water was bubbling, and he had just discovered carbon dioxide. With this newfound information and gases, Priestley decided to tackle the age-old mystery behind trees with an all-new experiment. You see, Van Helmont, the scientist who planted the willow tree, had incorrectly come to the conclusion that the matter that makes up trees comes from water, since he found that the soil was unaffected. However, he forgot to take into consideration one final source of matter, the air. Now, more than 100 years later, Priestley, with all his knowledge on gases and their different types, was ready to solve this mystery with an actual experiment. The experiment went as follows. Priestley took a plant, lit a candle inside a glass container, then he let the candle burn up all the oxygen in the container, only leaving carbon dioxide. Priestley let this container sit for 27 days. When the time period was over, the scientist relit the candle inside the glass and it burnt up once again. The fact that the candle was able to light up again and burn oxygen after 27 days showed that the plant had sucked in the carbon dioxide from the beginning of the experiment and converted that same carbon into oxygen. So, if the plant had taken in carbon dioxide, a gas made up of carbon and oxygen, and released into the air pure oxygen, the final question now was, where did all the carbon go? The answer was that it went straight into the tree and is what is used to grow the tree into its huge size. Priestley had finally solved the mystery. Trees and all plants are not made from minerals from the soil or in the water, but instead they're primarily made up literally from the air. Of course, when you cut up a tree you get wood, not a gust of carbon air. But at its core, dry wood is primarily carbon. It can be as high as nearly 70% carbon depending on the species of tree, carbon that was produced straight from the air. To this day, huge amounts of people still believe that trees are made up from mass that comes from the soil. However, that is far from the truth. So the next time that you look at a tree, remember that it appeared from thin air. Sort of. Now that you know, remember to
like and subscribe!